Good evening. I'm Lee Wright, the founder of History Camp. I'm near Boston, and with me in Virginia is...
Hi, I'm Carrie Lund, the director of the Pursuit of History. Thank you for joining us tonight. We are so excited to have with us Peter Stark tonight. He is a historian and author of Young Washington, How Wilderness and War Forged America's Founding Father. Thank you for joining us, Peter.
Yeah, great to be here and see you guys again.
Well, thanks. So Peter, your background as an outdoorsman makes you ideally suited to use this approach kind of into Washington. Probably everyone listening to this broadcast has seen or been to Mount Vernon, so it's interesting to think instead of Washington out in the wilderness. Talk to us about what his experience was and the period your book covers in kind of recounting his life.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny you mentioned Mount Vernon, that he had just come in possession of Mount Vernon, and it was really more like a smallish farmhouse at the point that I'm writing about. It was not the grand thing it is now by any stretch. And that, as you say, I come at this from an adventure and wilderness angle, that I'm an adventure writer and I've done a lot of outdoor and adventure things. And I was out in Western Pennsylvania some years ago, and in the woods, and I kept stumbling over this 22-year-old guy who was a young, very ambitious Virginia military junior officer getting himself in a lot of trouble, George Washington, and it was a side of the story I'd never heard. So that's what got me interested in this, and that there's this whole period of his life that I think relatively few Americans are aware of. I mean, we know that, sort of the iconic Washington, the general and the president, but, he didn't become the commander of the Continental Army until he was, I think it was 42 years old. So, what happened in the first 42 years, and especially in the years between the time he was roughly, in this case, 21 to 26. And those are the 5 years I focus on. And he went through very dramatic experiences, very transformative experiences, almost, nearly fatal experiences any number of times. And it ended up really shaping how he became a leader, how he viewed the world, so much about who he later became.
Well, that's very interesting. Set us up a little bit. Talk to us about what was going on in the world at the time and kind of what had happened in Washington's life up to this point where your book picks up.
Well, so, I'm sure many listeners know that he was born on a kind of a small scale Virginia plantation in the 1730s. And his dad died when he was 11, and George had two older half brothers from his dad's first wife, who had later died, who ended up inheriting most of the dad's land. And the two older half brothers of George also were given a formal British education, sent to British boarding schools by their dad. George had none of that. He was the eldest son. He had what we might consider maybe a partway middle school education. And when his father died, he got, some acres, but not enough to really support himself, or certainly not as a Virginia gentleman by any stretch. And so he was kind of thrown on his own resources to make a living. And his mom initially, he was thinking of going to sea. He had one of his older brothers, his half brother Lawrence, had served in the Royal Navy or alongside the Royal Navy, and suggested George go to sea. And his mother shot that down immediately. And this is when George was, I think, 14. And then George, at that point, he literally picked up his father's old surveying instruments and taught himself to survey. And he became, quite an accomplished surveyor in his teens. And, this is one of the very first characteristics that you see about him. He starts appearing in our consciousness and our history at this time. And the two of the qualities that come through right away are, one is ambition, really focused, and very ambitious to kind of make his way in the world. And two, he has this like amazing resource to teach himself things the way he taught himself to survey. And so that's what set him up for all these years in the wilderness and in the French and Indian War. And I can lay out a little more context about that too as we go along.
Let's go through that. I'll just make one observation. This surveying at that point was, I mean, you were out in the wilderness, right? And laying out essentially property lines. Is that right? For
yes,
transacting and so forth.
Well, and I was just writing about this today, and for my next book, actually having to do with the Ohio Valley, some decades later. But in those days, we have all these laser survey instruments and GPS and all that sort of thing. Well, in George's day, you had what was called a rod and chain, and the chain was literally that. It was a metal chain that had 100 links, and the chain was 66 feet long. And you hauled that thing into the wilderness, and a rod, which was, you used it both to stake out the chain and also it was another a shorter measure. And you had to literally lay down that chain on the ground. It didn't matter what the ground was, swamp, up a cliff, chopping through brush. And you measured like with a big tape measure, you measured the ground. And that's what George did. And he first got involved in that in any serious way when he was, 16. So Lawrence, his older half-brother, his eldest half-brother, married into a very wealthy aristocratic family that were, like true British heirs, the Fairfaxes. And the Fairfaxes had been given by the King of England 100 years earlier. It came down into their hands, 5 million acres of Virginia land. And I did the math on this because it's just so interesting, I think, to really know these details. So like we talk about our half-acre lawns, here in the suburbs, which that's a pretty sizable lawn. Well, so 5 million acres is a lawn 90 miles by 90 miles. And so the Fairfaxes had this enormous chunk of land, and a lot of it was, what we'd call wilderness or it's semi-wilderness, where today Virginia starts rising into the mountains and over the Blue Ridge and into the Shenandoah. And so the Fairfaxes were starting to sell off some of that land to settlers or to make money, and they were sending in a survey expedition. And this is when George was 16, and he'd just been learning how to survey. And they essentially invited him to go on this expedition with these kind of professional backwoods surveyor types. And so that was George's first experience. Really, it wasn't deep wilderness, but it was sort of semi-wilderness frontier. And I think one of the things that's so ironic about it is that he kept a journal. It was kind of his first little journal, and he kept his journal, and he's just like so taken aback by the hardships. There's smoke in the tent, and there are fleas in the blankets, and they have, they eat in the house of a frontier settler, and it's just a bare wood table. There are no linen tablecloths, and they're eating with big knives, and he's just like horrified. and then, but there was something about it that really appealed to him, and he kept going in that direction. He became a sort of a frontier backwoods surveyor on his own and started buying his own land at age 18 in the Shenandoah Valley.
That's fascinating. There certainly is that sense of rugged individualism, right? A great sense of personal pride in self-development, right? So talk to us then. Play that forward from his, 16 learning, 18 being a surveyor, starting to acquire property. What is next in the story?
Well, so the story, it takes a few threads there and then goes back together, but a lot of it had to do with Lawrence, his older brother. And Lawrence, who was married to a Fairfax and, was part of the family, Lawrence came down with tuberculosis and was very ill. And George ended up accompanying Lawrence to Barbados for recovery and Lawrence didn't recover. Lawrence eventually died, but Lawrence had been a sort of a junior officer in the Virginia military, the colonial military. And so when George came back from this Barbados trip, he checked in with the British governor of Virginia, governor British, we're talking colonial for sure. Governor Dinwiddie, was this big kind of Scottish merchant, 60 years old with, the wig and the brass buttons and the jowls and the whole 9 yards. And George made his acquaintance, and it was through the connection with his brother that Governor Dinwiddie, I saw him, maybe had dinner with him, and ended up either offering or George asked for a similar job as a kind of a junior officer in the Virginia military. And right about that time, if you see my lights going off and on, it's because there are lightning strikes going on outside. And so if I suddenly disappear in a flash and a poof of smoke, no worries.
On your book. People will still be able to read your book.
But you buy the book. I won't be around to talk about it, but feel free. So George got this kind of like, it'd be sort of like a National Guard sort of position. It was not full time by any means. But right about then, there are these geopolitics going on that extend into North America. And, as we all know, that the French and the British have been at war in Europe for about 700 years. And, intermittently, but mostly on. And at this point, they have this like brief period of peace. This is the late 1740s, early 1750s. And at that point, I usually kind of sketch out an air map here if I'm trying to explain this, but the French, as we know, are up in Canada. Those are the French colonies, and the British are on the east coast of North America. What's now east coast of the U.S., and where the 13 colonies were. And in between those two, there's this massive wilderness. Of course, it's inhabited by lots of Indian tribes, but to Europeans, it was a massive wilderness. It's an area about the size of France. It's the Ohio Valley, and both France and Britain think they have claims to the Ohio Valley. And there's nothing really back there in terms of European development, but there's a lot of potential back there. And so the French, who have actually been trading furs back there for quite some decades, almost a century, I believe, started building some forts back in the wilderness, in the Ohio wilderness. And Governor Dinwiddie of Virginia got wind of this. And, Governor Dinwiddie, or Virginia, when the first Virginia colonists staked out Virginia, they essentially planted two flags on the beach of the East Coast, a few hundred miles apart, and pointed west and said, we own all the land between here and the island of California. So Virginia is claiming the strip across the continent, which runs through the Ohio Valley. And France is starting to, saying, well, we've been trading back there for 100 years, and starts building forts back there. And so Governor Dinwiddie gets really upset and wants to send a letter to whoever the French commander is back in the woods building these forts to tell him to knock it off. But Governor Dinwiddie needs a messenger to go back in there, and he needs one right away, urgently. And at this point, it's fall, and winter's coming, and he's trying to find a messenger. And it appears that George essentially steps forward and says, "Hey, here I am, George Washington. I'll do it." And George does have some, frontier experience in his surveying days, but nothing like this. And so George sets off in October, and he has a legitimate backwoods guy, Christopher Gist, a very experienced wilderness guide, and they're on horses, and they actually have his servants to take care of the horses. And, it's not like he's backpacking with everything on his back. And the story goes from there, I should say. It gets, I can spin out more of it, but it gets very crazy and adventurous. They get slammed by snowstorms in late October crossing the Appalachian Mountains. and they're camping in tents. It's really nothing like George's experienced before, and it just gets worse as they go back.
So I think we do want to hear more about that. Let me ask one question though. At this point, had he been involved in any armed conflict?
No, not at all. I mean, he had zero military experience, which which comes to light very quickly in this context. So
let's do go forward. I think people have heard, George Washington started the French Indian War, that sort of thing. Take us through and tell us what really happened.
Okay, well, yeah, it's really crazy, and this is what really attracted me to the story, because it's such crazy wilderness stuff. And if you've ever done any of serious wilderness adventure, you realize this is like not lightweight activity. This is really edgy, and I that's one of the reasons I wanted to write the book, because I just don't think people really appreciate that, and I feel that actually that's what. That's the original research I can bring to this book, is that I understand what it's like to fall through a frozen lake, or, to paddle down an ice clogged river. And, I know how shaky these things are, run through a frozen forest on a starlit night. These are things that George did, not willingly. So to go on with the story, you hop in anytime. So what happened is, George is carrying in this letter from Governor Dinwiddie, the personal messenger, and they get slammed by snowstorms crossing the Appalachians. The farther they get back into the Ohio wilderness, the worse it gets. They, eventually get way back in there, and they come to a little French fort, and, the French officer greets Washington, and, Washington says, "I got this letter," and the officer says, "Oh, you got the wrong guy, dude. You got another week's ride that way." And literally, and so it's at least a week, really bad weather and snowing and raining, and they have to cross these big flooded streams. And they, by then, now they're up near Lake Erie. I mean, they're hundreds of miles back in there, and they finally get to the main French fort. And there they are greeted, by this elderly and very distinguished French officer, who's a professional military guy, and greets them with the formal dinner, and they literally have red wine imported from France, out here in the woods, those French, and the candlelight and the best meats and everything else. And the officer takes the letter and reads it, and comes back a while later and writes a response and gives it to George. And so George is under the order from Governor Dinwiddie to bring this response back as quickly as he can. So George, this is where you see his ambition really kind of soaring through. He is like, a man on a mission indeed. And he leaves as soon as he can. But we're up now near Lake Erie, and you have what they call up there, the lake effect, where you get these snowstorms off the lake. And so it was just blizzarding, and George and his guides start riding out, and the horses can't handle it. So they have to leave the horses, or they've had to send some horses ahead even before it started snowing, and they go in canoes. And now they're in ice-clogged rivers in these canoes, and they make it down the river, and they finally get to their horses again, and they start riding farther into the wilderness. And that at that point, George says, "Wow, these, the horses are weakening, and they can't find forage underneath the snow. The snow's so deep, and the streams are frozen, and they can't get water." So George says, "Well, these horses are too slow. It's taking too long. Let's just leave the horses." And Christopher Gist, the guide, is really opposed to this. And Gist is writing a journal too. So it's actually, when you really read it, it's hilarious, because you can see Gist just kind of like rolling his eyes like, bad idea, but he doesn't kind of want to say it, because he's really under young George, who's the officer, the young junior officer. And so Gist says something like, "Well, I was not sure Virginia gentlemen were used to walking," and which Virginia gentlemen did not walk. They rode horses, which George was a great horse rider. I mean, he was a great athlete in a lot of ways, but he was not a wilderness walker. He was a wilderness rider. So he comes up with this idea. We're going to walk. And they leave the other guys behind who aren't keeping up. And they start walking down these Indian paths in the winter, trying to get this message out to Governor Dinwiddie. And after a while, George says to Gist, essentially, these paths are winding all over the place. And, this is taking too long. I think we should take a shortcut straight through the woods. And, Gist again is like rolling his eyes and saying, does this guy have any idea what he's doing? And George, who's got all this surveying background, he has a compass and he's walked straight through the woods before. So, we can do it. And so they set off through this frozen forest, and they end up having these various misadventures, and they end up meeting an Indian who then they think this Indian is trying to kill them. And then they think they are being chased by a lot of Indians through the forest, trying to kill them through the snow. And they're leaving these tracks in the snow. So at this point, Gist and young George, essentially run for 40 hours straight through a frozen forest, night and day. They have a little bit of rest, utterly exhausting. I mean, it's like this marathon thing they were doing, thinking they were being chased. And they finally get to a river, the river we now call the Allegheny. And there, because it's so cold, at this point here, it's we're in late December. And it's so cold that they think the river's going to be frozen. And they get to the river and it is frozen, but only along the edges. And there are these big ice floes running down the middle. So they think they could walk across, but they can't. And they think they're still being chased by Indians. And so Gist, the experienced wilderness guy, says, okay, our best hope is to build a raft. And, of course, thanks to George, they've left the horses behind, which means they've left the good equipment behind, which means they only have this one little dull hatchet. And so they have to build a raft, like chopping logs with this one little dull hatchet. Finally get it together at sundown. And they shove this raft off the edge of the ice and they start poling it across, which is how they often maneuvered in canoes and rafts with poles in those days. And George, here's this young guy, he's like strong, he's over 6 feet, he's this athlete. And so he's, kind of fearless out there and pushing hard. And the raft starts getting wedged in these ice floes. And George leans his pole really hard, thinking he can overcome this current and these ice floes. And this ice floe shoves the raft against his pole, and the pole springs like a catapult and launches George into the frozen river. And, I say that having been in some of these situations, he came so close to dying right there. I mean, he came within an inch of dying, that you only have a couple of minutes to live in water like that, and you can no longer move. And what he managed to do, he managed to pull himself out on the raft. But, that's only where the trouble begins, because now they're out in the middle of a river and it's night and he's soaking wet. They make it to an island. And that I'm convinced that George would have died right there that night, which was a very, very cold night, if Christopher Gist hadn't been there. And Gist got a fire going. I'm quite sure that's the way it unfolded, because if they had no fire, George would have died for sure. And that that clearly they got a fire going. And the fact that Washington, young George, reported in his journal that Mr. Gist had all of his fingers frozen and some of his toes. And I'm pretty sure he had his fingers frozen because he was trying to start this fire with his tinder to save young George. And they made it through the night. George survived, as we all know. And next day, the river was frozen enough to walk the rest of the way out. And George eventually delivered the letter to Governor Dinwiddie. Of course, that's when the real trouble began.
Well, this is fascinating. I did not realize the extraordinary physical trial that he
Oh yeah, incredible.
And certainly your experience, as you said, gives you a real intimate understanding of what that can be like. Well, give us one more, tell us just a little bit more, and then we'll see what questions we've got. And I think this is, you probably whetted the appetite of many watchers to pick up the book and read the entire story. But talk to us a little bit about the encounter, which again, some say, sparked this large conflict.
Yeah, so that's, and this is sort of really kind of the heart of a lot of what happened and what came later, what happened in the next couple of months. So George, in his great ambition and haste, gets this letter delivered to Governor Dinwiddie, who's at the beautiful, existing to this day, governor's palace in Williamsburg, colonial Williamsburg. And Governor Dinwiddie reads the letter, and he's utterly outraged. His jowls are shaking, and everything else. And George is too, because what the French commandant has written is like, essentially, our two empires are at peace, and I would very much like to maintain that peace. But as for your suggestion that I leave, well, I don't think so. And it's not going to happen. And so Governor Dinwiddie gets so outraged. And so he instantly sends George back into the wilderness, but now leading a small military force. And of course, as we were saying, George has zero military experience. And this is what got him in such deep trouble. And in a way, it set off a lot more trouble, that he got way back in there, and he was told by an Indian guide who was traveling with him, who had joined him, that there was a party of French hiding out in the woods, camping in this rocky glen, and that the French were, likely to attack the British or the Virginia, military. And so George marched with 40 guys through the night, through wet underbrush, struggling along. And at dawn, they got to this rocky glen. And, the evidence is becoming clearer all the time. I mean, over the decades, really. But that George ordered his men in formation and had them sneak over the edge of the glen and open fire on these French guys. And they were a French diplomatic party having breakfast down below. So the thing just exploded into terrible trauma. A number of French guys died instantly. Others were, tried to run, but the Indians who were with George rounded them up. The French officer in charge was wounded trying to deliver a diplomatic response to George, that for Governor Dinwiddie or for George's commander. And at that moment, the way accounts, as you piece them together, put it, that one of the Indian leaders with George went up behind the French commander, the officer, and the Indian took his tomahawk and slammed it down on the officer's head, split open his skull, pulled out his brains, and the rest of the guys, got scalped. The ones who were wounded or dead, the others were taken prisoner. This did not sit well with the French at all, who had a fairly major installation back there in the wilderness. And so, but George at that point, instead of pausing, thinking it over, maybe going out and consulting with Governor Dinwiddie, he keeps pushing ahead, and he's going to go all the way to this French fort way back there. And it turns out to be a big mistake. And they start hearing that there's this huge French and Indian force coming towards them. So George and his guys turn around and they retreat to this ramshackle little fort they've built on a meadow. People have heard of it, Fort Necessity. And it's great. There's a great reconstruction, accurate reconstruction there. And if you've been there, it looks like, it's just laughable. It's like, it's like 50 feet across. And, talking about this, it's less than the size of your front lawn. It's like, it's really small. And there, George says, oh, we can sit here and hold out against an attack of 500. Well, that totally ends up not being true, because the French and Indians don't kind of come marching down into the meadow in formation and attack the fort and George's guys in the trenches. No, they go up and hide on a hillside right above the fort and start shooting down. And George's guys can't even see these guys to shoot. And they end up getting slaughtered in the rain and these muddy, swampy, bloody trenches. A lot of guys die, and it ends up being a total humiliation. George ends up signing these surrender documents, which he denies that he knew what he was doing, but in which he admits to the assassination of the French officer. And these are basically the events that get the French and Indian War rolling. It did not sit well with the authorities in London when George surrendered the fort, and the French were outraged with what George had done.
This is just fascinating, Peter. I think certainly one of the things we hear is George's tremendous commitment to mission, his perseverance, his willingness to endure physical hardship, not so much military acumen or strategy, which I don't think we're ever.
He learned it. I mean, he learned the hard way, and he did learn. I mean, he's very good that way. But go on.
Well, I just want to say again, this has really been fascinating. Carrie, do you have some questions for Peter? And remind us the name of the book again.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Carrie, you know the title. I don't.
Is Young Washington: How Wilderness and War Forged America's Founding Father. So this is actually really fascinating to hear all these, what I would say are pretty extreme experiences. So can you talk a little bit about how these experiences helped to form Washington's character and his leadership ability for the future?
Yeah, and that's really provocative question, really interesting, and there are lots of different permutations you could think, or I could think of with that. But the ones that kind of just in the period that we're talking about right at this moment, that I think one of the things I was just saying how he went marching forward rather than pausing and thinking after this incident called the Jumonville Glen, where Ensign Jumonville had his head split open, was killed. When that exploded, George, he thought he was just going to march on forward into the wilderness and go after this French fort back there, not realizing that what was going to come out after him. And so he, from what I can see, made that decision quite unilaterally on his own, just to push ahead. But then when he got back in there a ways, he realized that they were in trouble. And he actually, at that point, he sat down for the first time, that, to my knowledge, and consulted with all his sub-officers. What should we do? And that ended up, and he listened very carefully. I mean, and that became a really famous trait of his, and a really important one, and one that I think served him and ultimately this nation very well. That he was, before he made any major decision, he would assemble his advisors or his officers and solicit each one of their opinions, and without really saying how he might have felt one way or the other, and listening very closely, and then kind of weighing it all and deliberating. And that was, I think, a direct result in my interpretation from some of these early rash decisions that he made, plunging ahead when it got him in really deep trouble, like almost, dying in a frozen river and having this disaster in Jumonville Glen and Fort Necessity. So that's one that comes right out of that moment. And, another one is that I think that at that Fort Necessity battle, it was a really, in some ways, profound experience for George. And again, this is my interpretation. It's only from what I can see actually went on from, really closely reading the accounts. But you can imagine George, he's, what is he, 22 at this point? And, he's been leading these guys who are his age and, Virginians, and some are probably older than he is, and he knows some of them. And here they are in this swampy meadow and trenches outside this ramshackle fort with the French and Indians just blasting down on them on a rainy evening from a wooded hill. And his guys are just dying in the mud and the blood in the trenches. And there are these descriptions, these eyewitness descriptions, saying these trenches were full of mud and blood. And there were just guys, lying all over. And so can you imagine that if you were George Washington and seeing these guys who you knew, who you led, and you led them into this situation? So I think that was one of these really transformative moments, as I say in my interpretation, but that gave him this sort of greater sense of empathy, the beginning of a greater sense of empathy. He was so very kind of ambitious and self-centered at first, but in the course of these years in the wilderness and the years after that, you see this sort of growing sense of awareness and empathy for other people, and then sense of responsibility for them. And so this moment at Fort Necessity, I think, was really important in that transformation.
Definitely. So one thing you had mentioned was Washington's journal, and we get some information from that. When he died, his wife had burned their correspondence and a lot of his papers. So why do you think the journal survived that allowed us to kind of put this picture together and understand, how he started, where he came from?
Because it was captured by the French at Fort Necessity.
We'll do it.
Yes. And the French published it in a book because they were so outraged. It was like an entire book about the outrages committed by the British against the French. And this was, like example A, and, which provoked the French and Indian War. And so Washington, it was stolen, and he, captured when he had to surrender. They had to leave all their goods behind and march out of the fort. They could surrender with honors. They could, I think it was honors is the formal term, but so they could, play their drums, and I think they could carry their swords and their muskets and maybe one cannon and a flag, but everything else they had to leave behind. And among the things that got left behind was George's journal. And it's actually kind of curious that after that, he did not keep journals. And that, that might have been another lesson that he learned.
Hard lesson learned there.
Yeah. I mean, he didn't like to leave a paper trail, put it that way. And maybe he instructed Martha, it wouldn't surprise me at all if that's what happened, because a paper trail really got him in trouble early in his career. I mean, really in trouble with this incident. And so, that could be it. And that Martha's burning of the correspondence, it's really a sad thing for history. I can see how, in terms of their privacy as a couple, how that, I can see how you might want to protect that. But that there's also this aspect of Washington that, he was, I think it actually contributed to his greatness as a leader, but he was really self-conscious of his image and his image as a leader, his image as everything. He was very thin-skinned and really sensitive to criticism. And so I think that he wanted, I know he cultivated his image as best as he could. And I think that might have been one reason that Martha ended up burning the letters. Again, this is speculation on my part.
Right. No, that does make sense to me from what I know of him as well. So this has just been great. I think we have learned a lot of really interesting things tonight. So tell us what you're working on now.
Well, I'm working on something that's kind of grown out of this. That this, this Ohio wilderness, and really the push of first the British colonies, and especially Virginia, into the Ohio wilderness over the Appalachian Mountains, and the early push of white settlers over those mountains. And so I'm working on the period that started after the Revolution, and from in the late 17 and early 1800s. And especially I'm focusing on this great Shawnee Indian leader, Tecumseh, who tried to unify Indian tribes, of disparate tribes, some of them enemies, traditional enemies, to work together as one, so that the federal government, the white government, could not buy land from like individual sub chiefs or tribes, that the treaties had to be agreed to by all tribes. And so it was a very significant change that could have literally stopped the westward movement of the United States. And in that battle, there was both political and diplomatic and eventually military. Tecumseh was facing down a lot with an heir to an old Virginia plantation who bailed out of the plantation and went over the mountains and became an Indian fighter and politician. And that was William Henry Harrison, whom we know mostly as the whatever number president he was, who lasted 1 month in office and died. This was actually many years later when that happened. This is when he was a young man, the period I'm writing about. But he and Tecumseh knew each other. They respected each other. They fought with each other. They, debated with each other. It's a really interesting interaction. And it's a really interesting sort of dissection of how the westward movement really got rolling. And sort of the power of that, and the various land acts that were instituted. There's one called nicknamed the Harrison Land Act that really helped get the westward movement moving. So that's what I'm working on, and it all grew right out of this.
All right. Well, we will look forward to that one. That sounds great. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. And thank you everyone for watching. So next week, we will have Serena Zabin with us. She's going to be talking about the Boston Massacre, and she has approached that with a little bit of a different perspective. So we'll be interested to see what she has to say. And if you have not checked out America's Summer Road Trip yet, please do that. You can do that at americasummerroadtrip.org. We have that in the works for you for August 1st. We have 12 different historic sites that are excited to be part of that, and they're going to have some great tours lined up for you. So we're looking forward to that. And don't forget to buy Peter's book if you want to read more about it. We have the link in the comments. Thank you so much, everyone. Good night.
Thanks, Carrie. Thanks, Peter.
Yeah, good night. Thank you, guys.